Coughing up blood, a Vermont woman struggles to type on her computer. Her and her husband's organs are failing. One of their cats dropped dead mysteriously. Their others are in poor health as well. She struggles to tell her story. A warning: if the black-eyed kids come to your door, don't open it. Under any circumstances, don't let them in. Welcome back to Dark Frontier. Stories abound across the internet of sightings of these mysterious black-eyed children. While the cases vary, they all have one thing in common: the children begging to be let in. Well, what happens when you do open that door? What nightmares await when they're finally allowed in? This video is the second part to our series on black-eyed children. You can find the first part linked in the video and in the description. Vermont, 2016. A woman keeping her identity hidden wrote in to the paranormal site Week in Weird to recount a meeting with these black-eyed children that ended in heartbreak and suffering. I made the mistake of letting the black-eyed kids inside, and now I'm worried that I might die because of it. I hope this will be a warning to everyone who is ever in the position to make the same mistake that I did. In the midst of a blizzard in rural Vermont, the woman woke up in the middle of the night to a thunderous banging on her door. Living on a back road in a quiet little town, it was not unrealistic to think that a neighbor had gotten stuck trying to get home through the storm. Her kindness proved to be fatal. Her husband answered the door while she stood by watching, eager to help. It was a boy and a girl. They couldn't have been older than 8. They were dressed weirdly and had strange haircuts, she noted. Initially, my first instinct seeing kids caught in a snowstorm would be to bring them inside and bundle them up with blankets and hot cocoa. But that's not how this felt. They were unnerving. The children didn't make eye contact with the woman or her husband, and he asked them where their parents were. The children responded that they would be here soon and asked to come in out of the cold. Against their better judgment, the couple let them in. Her husband took the kids into the living room while she went into the kitchen to make some hot chocolate. From the kitchen, she could hear her husband trying to strike up a conversation with these children, asking where their parents were, if there had been an accident. They just kept saying, "Our parents will be here soon," in a sing-songy voice, she said. That's when she noticed something odd. The cats were terrified of them. Of the couple's 4 cats, all but one was hidden, and the one male cat that was still with the woman, Pigeon, had his hair raised and tail puffed out, staring out from the kitchen into the living room at the children. Returning to the living room, she found the children sitting completely still on the couch, but her husband's head was in his hands. He brushed off his wife's concerns, simply saying he felt dizzy and tired. As she handed the children their fresh cocoa, she nearly dropped the mugs onto the floor. She'd just seen their eyes for the first time. Their eyes were completely black. No whites, just giant black pupils. They immediately sensed her fear and stood up, asking to use the bathroom. After directing them to the bathroom, the woman rushed to her husband and asked if he had seen their eyes too. He had, but before he could say any more, his nose began to gush blood. Startled now, the woman was in frantic tears as she rushed to get her husband tissues. She'd never known him to have nosebleeds in all their years together. She knew this had something to do with the children, and that's when the power went out. I heard my husband yell for me and rushed back to the living room for him when I stopped dead in my tracks. The children stood in the hallway, silhouetted against the darkness, black within black, just like their eyes. That's when they spoke again. "Our parents are here." Walking out into the blizzard, the children approached 2 shadowy figures, each about 6 feet tall, dressed in formal suits in front of a dark car parked at the end of the couple's drive. The couple waved. The figures didn't wave back. A half hour later, the power returned, but the cats were missing, save for Pigeon, collapsed on the floor in a puddle of blood. The vets would say he'd had a brain hemorrhage. Her husband's nosebleeds persisted, and doctors told the couple it was simply dry nasal passages brought on by the cold. Soon after, he was diagnosed with aggressive skin cancer, a form of melanoma linked to excessive use of indoor tanning beds. Writing the story, the woman said she has recently started having nosebleeds and dizzy spells. "I'm in the worst shape of my life," she wrote. "I wish my husband had never opened that door." That same year, on the opposite side of the country, another victim would be claimed under mysterious circumstances related to these black-eyed children. Arcata, California. Following the anonymous woman's story on Weekend Weird, another story emerged, this time in California. A woman by the name of Jamelin told of her friend who met a grisly end after an encounter with what could only be described as a handler for the black-eyed children. According to Jamelin, this young man took a road trip to sunny California to meet a friend, and the night before leaving town stopped at a bar to have one last drink before crawling into bed at his hotel. There, he started flirting with the bartender. The two laughed and got close during her shift, and the beautiful woman told him he could stay with her for his last night in town. What started as the premise for a romance, however, was anything but. The bartender told him to leave his car there. She would drive him to her place, which she said was remote. "He told me he began to feel fearful when they arrived at her home," Jamelin said. "She took him to her room and the two got intimate. He said he was frightened of her then, too. She began to act unnatural and made sounds that he considered inhuman. Talk about a freak in the sheets." After the woman fell asleep, Jamelin's friend told her he got up for a drink of water. Making his way to the kitchen, he began to see them all over the place. The black-eyed kids moving about the house, coming and going. It was a large two-story house, and the woman had mentioned she had children, so he initially thought nothing of it. But it was nearly 2 in the morning, on a weeknight. Shouldn't they have been in bed for school? And then they began looking at him, watching him, with what he now saw were pitch-black eyes. The woman, it turns out, owned the bar where they met. She agreed to take him back in the morning, but dumped him off on the highway and made him walk back to his car. Jamelin said her friend seemed shaken when telling this story, but otherwise fine. Then he was diagnosed with advanced bladder cancer. He was a fit, athletic, and healthy young man. No medication or treatment seemed to work. Then, 6 months later, he died. Jamelin says right up until the end, he blamed his experience on that woman and those black-eyed children. Fear and death seem to follow these black-eyed children, and the mystery around them only seems to twist and grow more obscure the closer one looks. Since the 1996 Texas incident, which seemed to spark the black-eyed mania, many paranormalists have been split on whether these entities are more alien or more mythological. Their appearance, big black eyes, pale skin, a certain uncanny quality, seems to mirror how many describe extraterrestrials, chiefly the Men in Black. But their appearance and seeming inability to harm unless invited in also bears a striking resemblance to something older, the vampire, which superstition dictates cannot willingly enter a private dwelling unless allowed. Furthermore, these children are most often, if not exclusively, seen and dealt with at odd hours of the night. Black-eyed children, based on these first-hand accounts, seem like they might share similarities with extraterrestrials. Pale skin, black eyes, a human but not disposition. One doesn't have to look far to find recognizable traits in common associations, such as the Men in Black or even the Mothman-adjacent alien in man's clothes, Indrid Cold. To examine the alien theory regarding the black-eyed children, one simply has to connect the dots. Tracing accounts and locations of the black-eyed children reveals a curious trend when correlating their appearance to sightings of UFOs. According to several UFO site tracking websites, including Newfork and UFO Hunters, Texas is one of the largest hotbeds for sightings of unidentified flying objects. with 5,862 reports collected by Newfork since the 1970s. In 1996, the summer of the infamous encounter Brian Bethel had, there were 12 sightings within a 1 to 200 mile radius of Abilene, with the small town being the epicenter for this summer of saucers. In North Carolina, 2 separate encounters with the black-eyed children in 2009 and 2012 respectively are also surrounded by UFO reports. The first instance, at the Marine Corps' Camp Lejeune, is curious for a number of reasons. North Carolina has had over 3,500 UFO reports since the 1970s, with Wilmington, the closest major city, at just 40 miles away, documenting 200 sightings from 2001 to 2010. In 2009, coinciding with the young Marines' November encounter, UFO sightings seemed to form a sporadic trail across the state. From Franklinton in the north in early November down to Sanford, over to the Wilmington-Lejeune area on the east coast, then west towards the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Years later, in Raleigh, the trend continued. While no date was disclosed in Carey's story other than the year, Raleigh and its suburb Durham had 10 UFO sightings recorded from April to December in 2012. Ohio. Noetic's story of the black-eyed children took place, he said, the morning of July 10, 2010. Ohio has had just over 4,300 sightings since the 1970s, and July 10th was a particularly unique day. While Noetic never disclosed the city he worked in, 4 nearby cities had reports of UFO activity from the night of July 9th to the morning of July 10th. Those cities were Waterville, Cuyahoga Falls, Jamestown, and Hillard. Of those 4 locations, Hillard, which has a data center, reported its UFO activity just before midnight, within hours of Noetic's reported encounter. Vermont. Vermont's cautionary case about what happens when the black-eyed children are let in is where the strongest evidence that these beings are of an extraterrestrial origin comes into play. While Vermont is one of the lowest profile states for UFO activity, with only 588 reports listed since 1958, averaging about 9 per year. 2016, the year of the anonymous woman's encounter, saw over 30 sightings. California. The second fatal encounter with the black-eyed children was the young man and the attractive bartender in Arcata, California. California, which has a staggering 15,560 reports of UFO activity, saw a curious spread of reports in the spring of 2016. With this story being recounted in October, we can assume the encounter took place at least 6 months prior. From January to May of that year, there were 5 separate reports submitted to UFOhunter.com of activity in the area of Arcata and nearby city Eureka. The thing in common about the effects these children have on those around them is their ailments, burns, and forms of cancer. In 2022, thousands of pages of documents were released by the Pentagon pertaining to the U.S. Department of Defense's defunct Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, specifically designated for dealing with UFOs. Hidden in plain sight, among the scores of information attached to the report, was a list of physiological effects on people who had come into close contact with UFOs or unidentified aerial phenomena. The list, compiled by the Mutual UFO Network, included 129 reported cases of apparent abduction, 77 cases of electromagnetic effects on vehicles, 75 instances of perceived time loss, and 41 reported cases of burns. In 2021, A-Tip head-turned-whistleblower Luis Elizondo spoke to GQ magazine, stating, "You get a report from a pilot who says, 'Lou, it's really weird. I was flying and I got close to this thing, and I came back home and it was like I got a sunburn. I was red for 4 days. That's not a sunburn, it's a radiation burn.' Then a pilot might say, if they got a little closer, 'Lou, I'm at the hospital. I've got symptoms that are indicative of microwave damage, meaning internal injuries, and even in my brain there's some morphology there.'" Vampires can range from grisly to glittery. But one constant seems to always remain in the varied interpretations of vampire lore. They must be invited into a building or home. The exact origins of this belief are lost to time, but can be found in ancient customs held by the Scandinavians and the Celtics. The exact etymology of the word, even, has been shrouded in mystery to this day. It's reinforced by historical texts that the Catholic Church wholeheartedly believed in the existence of these creatures, having declared them as agents of the devil, and going so far as to create burial and blessing customs to dispel them and their progeny. Thinking of the other vampire trademarks, they're usually depicted as something between timelessly beautiful and uncanny, with pale or cold skin, which, along with the custom of needing to be invited in, digs up striking similarities with the black-eyed children. In Texas, there is some loosely documented historical case for vampires in the Lone Star State. Specifically, a legend around Dalby Springs, some 5 hours away from the black-eyed children sighting in Abilene. This vampiric tale comes from a website called the East Texas Journal, which notes that there is a caged grave belonging to a vampire in an old cemetery. The unmarked grave was fenced off from the rest with a stake driven through it, visible from above the ground. In Ohio, the state's greatest undead mystery seems to belong to the Vampire of Defiance in the 1960s. Blog site Dr. Fright explains, taking reports of a vampiric creature haunting the rural Canal Road, the Defiance Police Department attempted to interview several witnesses in the area and received permission to go onto their property and investigate. These residents were adamantly opposed, and any and all residents sought for questioning did not cooperate, and it seemed actively tried to hamper the investigation. What exactly were they trying to hide? On one snow-covered winter morning, similar conditions to the arrival of the black-eyed children many years later, onlookers in Manchester, Vermont gathered in the 1700s to watch the organs of a supposed vampire lit on fire. Rachel Harris Burton was a vampire. After she passed away, her husband remarried, and his second wife was soon stricken by a mysterious affliction that seemed to be sucking the life from her. Naturally, the townspeople dug up Rachel's body and burned her organs as a sacrifice to ward off the vampiric evil, draining the wife from Mr. Burton's second wife. While this was historically contextualized into a very, very poor understanding of tuberculosis and superstition, Vermont and New England as a whole was gripped by vampire panic. Between the 1790s and the late 1800s, farmers had reported their loved ones were returning from the dead to kill or suck the life out of their remaining family. Vermont seems as good a place as any for the undead to still be lingering, and of course their children too. California and vampires go hand in hand thanks to popular TV shows, movies, books, and even songs. But is there anything to suggest that this area really is a haven for the hellspawn? According to the legend of the Ojai vampire, yes. The legend begins in the late 1800s, similar to the Vermont vampire panic and the alleged death of the Texas vampire, and concerns a, quote, hideous man who moved to the coastal city of Ojai and was alleged to have sucked the blood from and mutilated cattle and animals. When the citizens had enough, they stormed his home and found a sarcophagus guarded by 2 black dogs. The paranormal site Dr. Fright stated the slab was allegedly hidden in a place near Camp Comfort County Park. Up to this day, people are claiming they know the location of the slab, but would not divulge it. To this day, his black guard dogs are still spotted in the area. While vampire legends and alien sightings seem to loosely connect these sightings of the black-eyed children and attempt to give some insight into what they really are, these curious entities remain as elusive as they are concerning. The only thing we can do is hope or pray that there's never a knock on our door.